The first step that we're going to take is to display a list of tasks. Actually, before I get into this, maybe I'll go through in the emulator and kind of show you how this application is expected to work. So can everybody see the emulator okay? Good. So this first iteration, again, is going to be pretty simple. We're just going to have a bulleted list of text right here in the middle of the emulator to show, or in the middle of the screen to show all the tasks that are added so far. Later on in the next couple weeks, we're going to be making that a little more interesting to look at and better to use. But for right now, when you add a task such as the sort of hello world of task managers, get milk, when I add that task, then I can see that come up here in a bulleted list format. And so now I can at least manage a list of tasks. Whether I can do anything more interesting with them is a problem that we'll have to solve in the subsequent weeks, but that's what we're going to be building today. And also, let's say that I'm adding another one. There's one more thing we want to do. If I cancel, it's going to say, hey, you've got some unsaved changes here. Are you sure you want to get rid of those changes? And I say yes, discard, and then it won't get shown in the list. And that's what we'll be building today. Okay, so the first step we're going to take, switch back to the slides here, is just displaying a list of tasks. The task screen is going to look like this for our first iteration. We'll just have that bulleted list in the middle, like I say, and then down at the bottom there'll be an Add Task button. And what's interesting about this screen, and may not be so obvious, is that the task list needs to take up all of the space on the screen, and given that the button is anchored against the bottom of the screen, and that's going to necessitate the use of our relative layout, and you'll see how the ins and outs of that layout work. So the steps we need to go to are we're going to add a task model object, which is what we'll use to keep track of each individual task, and we'll have a list of those that the task manager will display and the add task screen will add to. And then we'll put a text view in the middle of this screen, and we'll add an add task button and listen for when that gets clicked, and then go to the add task activity. So this is probably for this first step here, besides the different layout, is pretty similar to what we did last week. So that's a good place to start with something we're kind of familiar with. So I'm going to switch over to Android. Now this is sort of a fresh blank slate of Android. All I've done besides install the Android SDK addition to the IDE as a plugin, which there are instructions for on the site, I believe, is I've opened up this DDMS perspective, which we're not actually going to be using too much today, but it may show. We maybe have to switch over to that. And that also loaded the Android SDK, so that's something we need to do. I've also made sure that I've got a list of a couple different AVDs, or Android virtual devices, and we'll be using the one that's built against 1.6 using the Google APIs, and that's already running over here. We just looked at it. And I also moved the Package Explorer over here to the left so that I can get it out of the way. So there's not really much changed from just opening up Eclipse and installing the Android SDK IDE plugin for the first time. So, all right, to get started, I'm going to add a new project here in the Package Explorer, which is where I do most of the work that has to do with my project. So I right-click here and say New Android Project, and I get a little sort of form here, and I want this project to be called Task Manager. I'm just going to keep it in the workspace using the default location, and I'm going to use the Google APIs 1.6 emulator and build against that. The application name is going to be Task Manager. The package name, once again, that package name is important, not only as it's important in any normal Java application to namespace your your specific classes to make sure there's no names that run into names from other libraries you might have, but that is also in the Android world the unique identifier for your application. So I'm going to call it com.o'reilly.android.taskmanager. And Eclipse is generously offering to create us an activity, which will also create a layout and kind of get us started off with a little bit of generated code so we don't have to set things up so much. And I want that to be called the View Tasks Activity. So now I'll click Finish. There's a question?
Yeah, I have a really quick question. So you chose to build against the Google APIs instead of just the Android SDK because you know you're going to include some Google functionality later?
Yep, right. Later on down the road, we're going to add a map. So I'm just setting things up against the Google APIs right now. I mean, it doesn't really hurt you too much, and it leaves things open as a possibility. And then you won't have to switch. But switching is not that hard either, so it's not too much of a decision you have to agonize over up front. So here in the resources, you saw last week we built against a 1.5 APIs, but now when I build against the 1.6 APIs, there are different. Right off the bat, you can see some of the options for how things are not just localized and internationalized, but also set up for different screen resolutions in the resources directory here. Just like we had last week, we had a drawable directory which had an icon in it. In this case, it's given us 3 drawable directories: one for HDPI, one for low density, and one for medium density. Those are different screen resolutions. So you can have different drawables set up for different screen resolutions, and you have them named the same way, and those will show up depending on what screen resolution the device is running on. So you can optionally add that functionality. That's just sort of an aside here, but that is a difference from last week, so I wanted to call that out. But other than that, the rest of this project structure should look pretty familiar to you based on last week. And we have a generated layout main XML, and we also have a generated strings XML, and we have the manifest, and then we have the class that we created for our first activity, which was the view tasks activity. So let me just run that and see where we get. Oops. Okay, so the first time you run this, you need to go right-click your project, go to Run as Android Application, and that should be uploading and displaying on the emulator. So now this is what our task manager looks like. So there are the 2 strings that we had generated into our strings file. So to get this to look like our sort of comps, if you will, like this, we need to do a few things. Let's go in and edit the layout first. So I'm going to switch over to the layout main XML and start getting that set up the way we want. Okay, and here's the sort of layout editor mode, the visual layout editor, but I want to go into the XML. I'd rather look at that. And let me say line numbers. Okay, now we're ready. So the first thing is it generated us a linear layout, which is kind of the most basic common layout. We're going to change that in just a second, but let's get a few other things in place so we can kind of see why we want to change it. This text view says hello, and that's not that helpful. Okay, so I'm going to open up the strings file. Again, I can use my I like to use the keyboard instead of the mouse because it's faster. I can use this open resource by, on the Mac, hitting Command-Shift-R. I think on Windows it's Alt-Shift-R for open resource. So I can open up the strings XML. And I no longer need this hello. That's not something we need. I'm going to make this task manager look a little more human readable. And I'm going to add a string called tasks, which will be sort of the label, in our main XML. I'm going to change this text view to use that string instead. So there's a quick refresher. Oops, that's not text. We want that to be tasks. So that is a quick refresher on how strings work. Remember, this at string notation means that you'll find that in some sort of resources string XML structure inside of one of the XML files, probably called strings if you follow the generated code inside resources or res values. Okay, now we have a new sort of label to sit at the top. But if we look at our comps, we want to have underneath that another text area, and we'll just start with just a text area for now, and then we want to have a button underneath. So let's add those two things quickly. Text view, just copy and paste that because we want two, and then at the bottom of that we want a button, and we'll have the layout width for all of these be fill parent, which is going to fill up the screen horizontally, and the layout height will be wrap content initially on all these, although we'll be changing that in a little bit, and the button is going to sit at the bottom, and we want the label for the button to be add task. So I'm going to call this add task. Of course, when I save it, there's going to be an error here showing me that there's no such string in the resources. So I'm going to come here and add another line. By the way, I just duplicated that line, which is a nice little Eclipse shortcut by hitting Command-Alt on Mac, and I think Control-Alt on Windows down arrow. When I'm on this line, I can just hit that quickly and then get a duplicate line, which is nice. It makes copying and pasting so much easier, and everybody likes to copy and paste a lot in their code, don't they? So I'm going to call this add task, and I'll call the name of the string add task. And now over here, this should no longer be an error. And I also want to cut the text out of this text view. And now let's just, before we deploy it to the emulator, let's have a look at what the layout looks like. So now we have the task's title at the top, and we have a text area in the middle, and then we have the add task button sitting down here at the bottom of the text area, but not the bottom of the screen, which is the way we want. And let me switch this configuration over to portrait. There, that's more like we're expecting it to look. Now when I look back to the XML, we're going to fix that by pegging the button to the bottom of the screen and making the text view fill up the area in between. And we're going to do that by, first of all, changing the layout from linear to relative. Now a relative layout, it's going to complain because I need to change this bottom tag as well. A relative layout lets you lay out the children of the layout. Let me just indent these to get a little bit more visual flow. It lets you lay out the children of the layout relative to each other, which makes it easier to do a little bit more complex views than just sort of stacking things on top of each other. So what I'm going to do is add one attribute here to the button that is going to anchor the button to the bottom of the screen, and that is Android layout. And you can see I'm getting some completion here, which makes it easier to find what the possibilities are. I'm just going to arrow down to Android layout align parent bottom and set that equal to true. Now when I go back to my layout view, you can see that the button is lined up against the bottom of the screen, which is exactly what we want.
So Tony, what's the difference between align parent bottom and just align bottom?
Align bottom takes a reference to another item on the screen. So I could say align bottom equals, well, here, let me just jump ahead because this will illustrate this point. Later on, I'm going to need to get a reference to this text view. so that I can do some layout stuff. So I might as well set this up right now. I'm going to give this an ID of @ID plus tasks title. So now I have a title here. Oops, got that backwards. Sorry, guys. Plus. Okay, so now I have an ID on here. That means I can reference things in Java with an ID, but I can also reference them inside this view. So if I wanted to, say, lay out the button directly underneath that text view, I could say Android layout bottom equals that tasks title button, the ID of that, like this. What is it complaining about?
Is it a line bottom?
A line bottom, yes. There we go. You're right. Okay, so now when I go to the layout, actually I think I need to grab this out of here for just now. Now you can see it's aligned. The bottom of the label and the bottom of the button are aligned with each other.
Okay, yeah, that makes total sense.
Yep. So that's that. I think actually, let me make sure that that's the case real quick. If I change this to a linear layout and save it, no, I can still do a layout align bottom. Some of these properties aren't available inside of certain layouts, and I thought layout align bottom was one of them, but it looks like it's okay. You can still do that, which is a little strange, but maybe we can test that later. If anybody has any more questions about layouts in general, we can do that on the forums. But this particular layout, we'll have time for questions in a little bit. So if any of this is not making sense, I can clear that up for you. But in any case, we don't want layout align bottom here. We want layout align parent bottom. And as you saw in that list of options that came up, there's also align parent top, left, and right, so you can put things on different sides of the screen. Okay, so now we have the button on the bottom. Switching back to the layout view, there is still the need to put the text that is sitting underneath of the title, which is going to be our main task view area. We need to make that expand from the bottom of our title to the top of our button. And the way to do that is actually there's a couple different ways, and this is kind of exposes one of the weird quirks of relative layout that I wish would be fixed in later versions of the Android SDK. And I also alluded to a little bit at least tangentially in last week's discussion about the IDs of the linear layout. So let me make that more clear. Here's what we can do. There's two things we can do, and let me do. Let's see. I'll do the first one first, which is kind of the weirdest, and what I thought was the only possible way to do this at first, but then I found out there's a better way. So what I need to do when I peg the top of this text view for the list of tasks to the bottom of this task title text view, and the bottom of the text view to the top of the button, is reference those IDs. And I can only reference an ID once it's been initially sort of declared like this with the @plus ID, which actually generates the ID with this name. So the first time I reference the ID, it has to be with this plus sign, which sort of initializes it, if you will. And if I need to refer to it elsewhere in the XML, it needs to be already initialized somewhere above it in a lower line number, basically, which is kind of a pain. So by the way, I need to add an ID for this button, so I'm going to copy and paste in some code here. So now I have an ID for both the button and the task title, and what makes the most sense to someone, I would assume, is that you define the ID when you define the tag. So I'm defining the ID or adding the plus sign, or instantiating it sort of where I define the tag that it goes along with. And if that's the case, when I do these, I'm going to paste in some code here too. Let me bump this up on the screen and make it a little more viewable. When I do what I need to do next, which is layout below and layout above, just like Beth kind of alluded to, the ID of task title and laying out above the button, which is going to put this view's bounds between those two other components on the screen, I need to have those IDs already referenced, which is weird. It puts us in a weird position because now I have to define the text view at the top and the button next, and then the text view after those, even though this one is going to sit in the middle of these two in the view. And the problem occurs because I have to do this initialization of the ID first. I hope that's making sense. So now we get what we want with this text view. If you can see the red line sitting underneath the title and above the button. But it's weird when you look at the view because it doesn't follow that same continuity. So that is one way that you can set up your relative layouts, but it doesn't sit well with me. So there is another thing that you can do, and this is kind of what I alluded to last week. I could put this, which I think is a win, in the order that I expect to see them on the screen, except now when I save them, I'm getting an error over here on line 13 referencing that text view. I'm referring to this button, but the button ID has been instantiated down here. So what I can do, and this is weirder, but I think still sort of a better situation, I'm going to define the ID button, the ID of the button inside the text view, and then reference inside the button itself. I hope that makes sense to everybody, but we'll have time for questions in a second. Actually, let's just take some questions on that. That's kind of a weird deal. Does anybody have any problems with that?
Does anybody have any questions about that? We did get one question in the chat room that asked about using linear layouts with layout weights instead. But so that would be a completely alternative way of doing it.
Yeah, let's save that question to the forums, but that may be another way of doing this same screen. Yeah. So basically layout weights are, you can put a weight on these components and it'll say take up more of the screen or not. I usually find that as my views get more complex, I wanted a relative view anyway, or a relative layout anyway, so now I've kind of gotten in the habit of starting in there.
Well, let me just summarize to make sure that I understand what you've done, and then hopefully it'll be understandable to other people and in the same way. So basically you had to choose between doing the layout in the order in which the elements appear on the screen or doing them by their ID when their ID is being declared. And what you prefer is to do them in the order that they're laid out on the screen. So we have the two text views and then the button. And because of the ID of the button isn't declared when we need it, you're changing the declaration of the button to be inside the text view rather than on the button itself.
Yeah, because I would much rather have the tags for the components be in the correct order, because that's how I'm thinking about if there's a problem or if I need to add a new layout element or something. As I'm scanning the XML, I'm expecting to see the components in a certain order. Now that just may be a quirk for me, but I don't know. I feel like that's a more important thing to optimize for, because that's what I expect to see, and the ID weirdness is just sort of a red tape you have to jump through to get to that point.
And you don't recommend necessarily one over the other, just whichever makes the most sense to you as the programmer?
Yeah, and your team. And, if it's just you, then you can do whatever you want. If you confuse your team by doing one thing, then maybe that's something you have to optimize for as well.
Okay.
Okay, cool. So we spent a little bit more time than that probably warranted, but I wanted to make sure that everybody understands that, because that's kind of a weird quirk of the relative layout. All right, so now that we have the button referenced with an ID, and we have the well, no, we don't. We need to add the ID for the text view. Let me just copy and paste in the ID. Yep, wrong place. Okay, now we have IDs for all these guys. Let's go look at the Java activity, because we need to get reference to a few of those views so that we can work with them. So here, this is the generated activity, all the boilerplate code that Eclipse generated for us. I'm going to clean this up a little bit, get rid of the comments, and then set content view associates this activity with that view, loads that view, and then kicks things off. Now I need to get a reference to a few of those elements, so I'm going to do what I do often and push that off into a different helper function called set up views, so I can keep the onCreate clean. This is an interesting feature of Eclipse that I like, because it kind of lets me code the way I think instead of working ahead. So I want to call a method called setup views here, but when I type this into Eclipse, it says, "Hey, what are you doing?" That's not a method that I know about. So I can come and hover over this with my mouse and choose what's called a quick fix, and it says that it expects that I probably want to fix this by creating a method called setup views. So I'll click that, and there we go. We have a private method setup views, which is exactly what I wanted. And now I want to get a reference to that button and also the text area. So I'm going to create a field level variable, but I'm going to do it in kind of the same way using an Eclipse quick fix, but let me type out the whole thing so that it has more information to go on. So just like we did last week, to get a reference to a view that is set up on the view that's set as our content view, we need to use find view by ID. So I want to get a reference to the add button, and that is a button. So I'm going to come hover over here and say import, and then find view by ID, which will find the view called r.id.add. It didn't add button. Okay, now I can hover over this, and Eclipse gives me a couple different options, and I want to create not a local variable. I want to have a field so I can get referenced. If I need to reference that elsewhere in the class, it'll be something I can do. So I'm going to click create field. Then you can see it added a line up here on line 9, private button, add button. So now we have a field for that button. And I'm going to do the same thing here for task text and paste this in. And then come here, control space, we'll import text view. Or I can hover over it is another option. And then I want to also, instead of just hovering over this with your mouse, you can hit Command 1 or I believe Alt 1 on Windows, and it will give you this menu. So if I'm using my keyboard instead, I can say Command 1 and then tab down or arrow down to the option that I want. Okay, so now I have two private fields, one for the button and one for the task text, which I'll call task text. And the first thing I want to do after I have reference to those is quickly set up a click listener on the button. So I'm going to paste in some code here to save some typing. This is exactly what we saw done last week. I'm going to set up a new anonymous class here, which implements the view onClick listener, which has a method onClick. And then I'm going to fire up an intent, which comes from viewTaskActivity.this, which remember is sort of the red tape we have to jump through because we're inside of this anonymous class. And I want to go to a class called addTaskActivity. And then I will start that activity with that intent. But we need to create that class, so I'm going to create the class right now. I can hover over this in Eclipse, and it says that, well, I don't know what this class is, so I expect that you would fix that by creating the class. So I can click on Create Class, Add Task Activity, and then I'll get this form to set up a new class. And a lot of things are already filled in for me, which is useful. I want it to be in this package. There's no enclosing type. I'll just leave it as public. The superclass, though, is going to be an activity, and I can hit Control Space in here too, remember, from last week. And now I have everything set up. It will create the class for me. And now let's do one more bit of useful Eclipse magic, and we'll go to Source, and we'll say, just like we did last week, I believe as well, override or implement methods. And we will choose on activity on create method. And we'll say set content view to be r.layout.add tasks. And that doesn't exist yet, so that's not going to show up or that's going to show up as an error, so I'm going to go create that as well. And I create that inside of Res for resources layout. I can come here and say new file, and we'll call this add tasks.xml.
So basically what you're doing here, Tony, is you're saying we need to have a new view called add tasks for adding the tasks.
Yep, and right now it's going to be pretty thin, but I'm just sort of sticking it in there so that we can navigate there and make sure our click listener is working. So what I'm going to do is copy and paste in a little bit of XML here just to get us going. And instead of a relative layout, I want this to be a linear layout.
So we had a couple of comments, Tony, that you went a little too fast on that section. Would you mind just kind of going back just a couple of minutes and going over that again?
Sure. So what I did from the view task activity is, just like last week, I want to be able to click on that button, which looks like this in the layout, the Add Task button, and go to a screen where I can add tasks. So to do that, I have to have an activity for adding tasks, and I need to have a click listener on this activity to interpret that click to mean to open up that task, add task view. So back here in the activity, I've set up a click listener on the button, on the add button, which starts a new intent, just like we looked at last week. Intents of this type allow you to go from a certain context. In this case, the context is this instance of the view task activity, and then I want to go to the add task activity. But since that wasn't created yet, I'm just kind of showing you a bit of a workflow that I like to use in Eclipse, which is I type the code that I want to have, and then when Eclipse doesn't understand that, it usually helps me by giving me options for generating code or setting up variables. So all I did was type that before I had the code that would actually make up the add task activity class. And then as I typed up that, it gave me the option to create the class, so I created this add task activity over here and then added a method called onCreate, which is, you'll remember from last week as well, the first method's going to be set up or run during our life cycle of this activity, and that lets us set up the view just like we do inside the view task activity. When I switch over there, you can say the same thing happened here. We loaded the content view that's named main, which is in the main XML file. So I loaded a content view that didn't exist yet, r.layout.add tasks, and then I just went and created that XML layout here, and I set that up as a linear layout. And there's going to be nothing in it, but at least everything should be ready for us to click that button and go to that activity. So at this point in last week's episode, we were kind of rushing a little bit, but does anybody remember what the next thing we need to do to make this add button actually work and not crash? There's one other thing that we needed to do.
Manifest.
Yep.
Somebody
Good.
says manifest, yes.
Yep, so the manifest needs to know about all of the activities that we want to reference. And so if I open up the Android manifest, you'll see that it's, well, they give us this form editor view, which I don't really like. I like to see the XML. So Android knows so far, if you remember from last week, that this package is the identifier for our app. And then inside the application tag, we list all of our activities, and there is an activity for the view task activity. But we also need to know that there is a add tasks activity. Add task, I called it, not task. So, or not tasks. And then I'll just keep the label the same, since we already have that string set up. Oops, close the tag. And now the manifest knows about the other activity, so therefore we can call it. So I should be able to go from here and run our application. So I can go up to the big play button at the top, since I've already run this once, and click on Task Manager. And we should be able to at least see our button laid out at the bottom of the screen. And when I click it, I can go to this next view, which is blank. And if I click the back button, I can go back to the original view inside of the first activity. So that, I think, completes our first steps. So now we have a text area where we can put tasks. We have a title at the top, and we have the button at the bottom. We don't have any tasks to show yet, but the button does work, and that will allow us to go to the next step, which is where we'll put in tasks. And by the way, here is a list of the files that were created by Eclipse during this step. So we have a view tasks activity, which is the controller that we set up, or the activity that we set up, and layout of the main XML file, which is used by that view task activity. And then one thing I forgot to create is the tasks model item. So let me, let's just go on. I'll create that right away during the next steps. I want to make sure that everybody understands where we've gotten so far during these steps, because I did take a few detours there, but hopefully that explained more why I took the detour last week, which was that little discussion about the IDs and their placement. So is there any questions about what we've done so far during these steps?
We do have a few questions, and a lot of people are asking to see the code for add task activity again.
A very common request, I might add.
Common request there.
As well as the manifest again.
Okay, so can you do the manifest on a split screen? Awesome. So we had a couple of questions. One was, can view tasks activity.this be replaced with this.getContext?
So let me switch to that code. Sorry, everybody who's still typing that out. But here, I'm going to get rid of this manifest too. Our font is a little too big for that to make sense. Okay, so the problem is if I did that, well, maybe that would work. It's not. The on-click listener does not have a get context.
Ah, okay.
In the add tasks activity, when you set up the set content view part, when you did the r.layout.add task, what was the hotkey that you used to create a new layout?
I didn't use a new layout there, or I didn't use a hotkey there. I just actually went and created a new layout by going here to the package manager and right-clicking the layout directory and saying new file. So no hotkey. Okay, good. Let's get on to creating a little bit more. Or is there more questions?
There was one more question I wanted to ask you. And somebody had asked about using fill parent as a layout option.
Okay. What was the question?
I'm trying to find it here.
Oh, I see.
So they had suggested using layout height equals fill parent. Oh, you did use that.
Well, okay, I see what they're asking. So back here in main, they're asking, well, why can't I do, I think this is what they're asking. They're saying, why can't I use the layout height of fill parent for this middle view to get it to layout and take up more space? The problem is if I did that, it would overlap the title and the button as well, because it would actually fill the parent, the whole thing. There's no, it doesn't do any automatic layout against other components on the screen when you're using a relative layout.
Got it. Okay, great.
So I have a question regarding add task activity. Somebody commented, Claborda commented, it looks like a view task activity except with a different layout. Is this correct?
Sort of. Well, let's get to that one next, because that's what we're going to be doing next.
Okay.
All right. Good. Let's go on then. We'll get to. We're saving up questions for the end too. So if your question didn't get answered, we'll come back to it.